It's FAQ NYC Off Cycle, where the New Yorkers podcast from the newsroom by and for New Yorkers, the city, steps back to take different and deeper looks into some of the things that are always happening here in the only place in the world. I'm Alyssa Katz, the city's executive editor, and in this installment of FAQ, I'm speaking with Paul Moses, an esteemed journalist who has covered New York City for decades, professor emeritus of journalism at Brooklyn College, and author of a new book just out from NYU Press, The Italian Squad, the true story of the immigrant cops who fought the rise of the Mafia. Let's jump right in. Paul Moses, welcome to FAQ NYC.
Thank you, Alyssa.
So let's get started here. I wanted to know, what got you on this subject in the first place? The Italian Squad, this NYPD force that was detailed to go after what was the early makings of the American Mafia. What got you on this?
I had done a previous book on history of New York's Irish and Italians. And it was at one time a very contentious relationship with the theme that they eventually got quite close and intermarried. But I had a chapter on that about the early Italian police, especially Joseph Petrosino, who became the head of the Italian Squad, and the difficulties they had in dealing with an Irish-dominated police department. And I just maybe want to write more about it. The story really seemed like such a good story, so I came back to it for the next book.
So you're talking about it being a good story, which it very much is, but there's also some really powerful themes that we'll talk about in this conversation around policing, around the history of immigration, around this time in New York City, kind of at the turn of the 20th century, where all these kind of questions around assimilation and what it meant to be Italian American and what it meant to be American, and what the purpose of policing was, are all kind of in play. So I'm curious what are there aspects, and there's also just sort of interesting stories, right, in the mix as well. But what drew you and made you convinced this is a book, this is a story that needs to be told?
I think the immigration aspects of it appealed to me a lot. In my journalism, I've done a lot of reporting on the immigration system, and just seeing how a ethnic group was really targeted as criminal just seemed relevant today also. And the Italian Squad detectives were very much in the middle of the cutting edge issue of the era, immigration, and ultimately immigration was cut off. And the furor over crime, especially crime in the Italian community, I think contributed a lot to the movement to end immigration. So that part of the story appealed to me a lot also.
Yeah, there's a lot of names. You mentioned Joseph Petrosino, and I had known that name. I'm a Brooklyn resident, and I had known that name as that's that park over, I think it's in Bensonhurst, right? And who is this Petrosino? And I didn't know until I read your book. And you start your book with Petrosino. And tell us about who he was and why he's such an important figure in this history.
He was an Italian immigrant who caught the eye of a notorious police inspector nicknamed Clubber Williams, who saw some use in him and got him into the police department. And after quite a few years of laboring, he caught the eye of Teddy Roosevelt when he was a police commissioner, and Roosevelt promoted him to detective. There were hardly any Italian-speaking police officers, and there was Italian community just growing and growing, with one of the world's great migrations underway. And so really all the Italian crimes were channeled to him. And he was good at his detective work, became very famous. 1904, the city was in the midst of a big hysteria over so-called Black Hand bombings. And under pressure from the newspapers, and I would say also from the Italian community, the police commissioner at that time created the Italian Squad with Lieutenant Petrosino as its head.
Right. And then, Petrosino, there's a reason there's, again, a park named after him, and that he became kind of a legend, and he became a martyr for this cause, right? And specifically around his, he goes to Sicily, he is trying to connect these dots. And it was very evocative, of course, of more recent NYPD expeditions, particularly around Muslim terrorism. But, you have this NYPD lieutenant who's going to Sicily to try to help solve, I think, some crimes that affected New Yorkers. And there's also this kind of very sensitive issue you touch on in the book around the links between immigration and crime, which of course remain very explosive today as questions to discuss. I mean, back then there was both the reality that most Italian Americans were not at all involved in crime, and in fact were much more likely to be victims, right, of all these extortion rackets, other things that were going on. And then you had mafiosi from Sicily who were escaping Italian justice. And then Petrosino tries to get in the middle of all that.
Exactly. Petrosino felt that very strongly, and you see it between the lines of a lot of newspaper coverage of him. He got a lot of coverage that he keeps trying to tell reporters that, it's only a very small minority of Italians who are committing these crimes, and most people are here to work very hard, and the Southern Italians coming in may not be that well educated, but they will be, and they're going to be productive citizens. But there's a very strong, movement fed even by eugenicist theories that were, totally acceptable to leading academics at the time, that Italians would never make citizens in the United States. They didn't have the quality to do that. So he's working against that. He goes to Sicily in part because there is a law that was passed in 1907 that says that if people have come in with criminal records from another country, they can be deported back within the first 3 years. His situation in New York is that he's got good ties into the community, but people still don't want to testify. So he knows a lot more than he can prove in court. But he doesn't need any witnesses if he can get these certificates and deport the people he suspects back to Italy. So that's the general aim of his trip. He also wants to arrange contacts in there and sources and better relations with the Italian police. So that's the reason he goes. And, he's famously murdered there in Sicily, March 12, 1909. And I chose to start the book with that scene. It usually ends stories about the Italian squad, but it actually goes on until 1922, on and off. And I'm intrigued because he remains a character throughout, like that person whose photo was on the wall, maybe. He's an influence. The people who lead the squad after him or close to him, they really, really want to solve his murder. And, of course, they're laboring under the threat of similar violence to themselves. So that's where he is. And, to me, I think he's probably the most famous police officer we've had in New York City.
Yeah, that's it's a fascinating story. And before we get into sort of more fascinating stories and more of the dimensions of what happens next with the Italian squad, I wanted to get a sense of your research methods, like how you went about telling the story. And as an editor and journalist covering New York City now, sort of seeing the depth of material that you have access to archivally, a lot of which I think would now be classified or very difficult to access. But in some cases, you're dealing as well with, news coverage. But there's a real mix of materials in play here and a lot of very revealing insights. So how did you go about that?
I mean, certainly newspaper coverage is very important, but you really have to be careful with that because this was a subject that was really prone to being sensationalized. But there's a lot more you can do. For example, I've found a lot of details on Petrosino's murder and the initial response to it in records of the State Department that are now available, because all the communications between New York and Italy were routed through the State Department. And there was this one poor guy who was the U.S. consul in Palermo when Petrosino was murdered there. He had gotten to know Petrosino. And he also has his own archives that are kept at Yale. He had been a popular novelist back in the day and a professor of literature at Yale. And here he was in his later years, he's 62, and he gets, first of all, in the middle of the giant earthquake in 1908, and now 1909, he himself was getting threatening letters after Petrosino was murdered. So he kept an interesting diary and also lots of official records that he had. So there are sources like that. The next commander who stepped in, Anthony Vacris, he had been commander of the Brooklyn unit of the Italian squad, because in those days, Brooklyn was still kind of looked at itself as a separate city. And he got very good coverage in the Brooklyn Eagle because he was from a Brooklyn institution. You could clearly see that this was his paper, and whatever he thought was in the Eagle, right? So he went over to complete Petrosino's mission, and fortunately he kept a diary and left it with his family. So the Vacris family gave me a copy of that. And so things like that are really helpful, and it also gives you a sense of where the papers are right and wrong, because after he came back, the commissioner forbade him to speak to anybody about his trip. And there had been a change in police department's leadership, so he was in the doghouse when he came back, and even the records he had risked his life to get weren't used. But
it's incredible.
but if you compare, so I think the reporters at the time were relying on police headquarters gossip to report what Vacris had done in Italy, but it was really terribly off the mark. And I know because there's a diary which they wouldn't have had access to, except the Eagle. The Eagle kind of had the story right, because Vacris must have talked to them for background.
Little journalism methods insight there.
One other thing, court records are very helpful too, because they really take a crime apart, and So.
And you talk about the secrecy around Vacris's return. It's quite in contrast with, I think, one detail about Petrosino's murder. It was just astounding. Is that the police commissioner announces before he goes to Sicily that he's going to Sicily to hunt mobsters. Right? It's just incredible.
You and I both covered City Hall, so the back and forth that goes on between the reporters and the mayor and the police commissioner. And he just got so frustrated. The Tammany aldermen just couldn't stand this police commissioner at Bingham, who was a very blue blood Republican,
anti-Semitic,
yes. But he did like the Italian squad. In some ways, he was good for the Italian squad. So he actually wanted to create a secret squad that reported only to the commissioner, of civilian investigators, so they wouldn't even be in the records or subject to departmental discipline or anything. And Petrosino was sent over under that umbrella, and the alderman would not give him funding for this, but he managed to raise it from private sources, probably like Rockefeller and people like that, and I think Italian merchants who were afraid of being
better than protection
down.
Money. You pay the cops to get rid of these guys,
and so he couldn't resist blabbing that to the reporters. Yes. And Petrosino arrives in Italy. He visits his hometown of Padula, which is near Salerno, sort of to the south. Sees his family, his brother, who he hasn't seen since he was a boy. And he finds out that this has been leaked into the papers back home. He's just outraged, And plus, they sent him by himself. They should have never sent him on his own on a mission. And I guess I shouldn't get started on this, but this is really a diplomatic mission. He met, with very high up officials that, really beyond the world of a police lieutenant to do that. It was a mess.
Seriously. And, the politics are really a theme throughout this book as well, right? Because, different mayors come and go, and sort of the comings and goings themselves are fascinating, right? One mayor is a subject of an assassination attempt, and another, mayor falls out of a plane, right? This is all part of New York City history. But as each of these administrations turn, and even within administrations, you have different police commissioners, and there's different degrees of hostility, incompetence, pro-Tammany, anti-Tammany, all happening. And the Italian squad sort of has different iterations and lives throughout this.
It gave me an appreciation for how much police work does depend on who's in charge in City Hall. And that probably still holds in a lot of ways.
Sure. And I think the most immediate effect that you talk about in your book, you talk about Vacris, who's the successor to Petrosino in heading the Italian squad. And how many months or years was he actually able to do this work before he was no longer allowed to?
Well, he was head of the Brooklyn squad from 1907 to about 1909. And then from about 1910 and 1911, they brought him into Manhattan because they realized they needed him. There were kidnappings that weren't being solved. They were all over the newspapers. And he was good at what he did. I had a lot of respect for Vacris as a cop, but he just did not tell the bosses what they wanted to hear. And they started reducing the squad a lot, and he started complaining. And then he testified before a Brooklyn grand jury that was looking into why the police commissioner is ending the Italian squad, and he testified there. And all of a sudden, he was transferred. Wound up on City Island, and City Island in those days to get there. People were taking horse-drawn carts and.
Well, he lives in Brooklyn. Let's just clarify this.
Yeah,
he's not just coming from the Bronx. He's coming from Brooklyn.
Yeah, he lived in what we would call Sunset Park. So, in fact, that was probably the most popular neighborhood for police officers in that day. But yeah, so
and he's on street patrol there, right? He's not running a unit or anything.
Well, he was still a lieutenant,
Okay.
so he was working from an office like on a night shifts and stuff like that. But yeah, no, and the newspapers eventually began to ask, where is Vacris? They knew that they needed him, and they needed the unit, but yet there's still a question: do you want an Italian squad? Do you want a squad named for one ethnicity? And in the beginning, the leadership of the Italian community, the answer was yes. But within a couple of years, there was a lot of controversy around it.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask about that. I mean, you basically had elements within and not just elements, but like leaders within the Italian-American community as they're trying to kind of counter some serious prejudice, including within the NYPD for that matter, but throughout society. These ideas is, that Italians are inferior or not sort of don't have the makings of being good Americans. And they're like, no, we're just like everyone else. We're entitled to be here. And then, I think it was along with that you really had pushback around this effort to really target criminal elements within the Italian community. Yeah. So you talk a little bit about how that played out.
Yeah, there was a division within the Italian community. And those who were pushing for the Italian squad tended to be a little closer to the reform movement, and the reform movement did not really have the pulse of the Italian community, I would say, to put it nicely. And the leadership, like the publisher of Il Progresso and people like that, were against it. So yeah, that's how that played out. But I found that it kind of existed in a shadow form, the way things tend to happen sometimes in the police department, when they announce we're disbanding this unit, but it's sort of like still is around, not called that anymore. And that's what happened. And the detective who kind of played the lead role in that period was Charles Correo, who I deal with a lot in the book, who distinguished himself as the first winner of the NYPD's Medal of Honor, their highest award. So he was, he had done a lot of good work also.
Yeah, and you also highlight at least there's one chapter where you focus on organized crime that is definitely not Italian. It involves the murder of Herman Rosenthal and the scandal around kind of how the police handled and mishandled that. And, you call it a crime that set off the biggest policing scandal in New York City history. I have to admit, shamefully, I was just not aware of this episode in history. So why don't you tell us about that and how this kind of fits into this larger narrative?
There was a mayor who took office. He was the one who was shot in office, and he didn't die. He persisted for a while. But William Gaynor, he's actually one of the most interesting people in the history of the city that I've seen anyway. There's a statue of him or a bust of some kind in Cabin Plaza. He was a true civil libertarian, and he was very alarmed by police violence, by unnecessary arrests. I mean, the whole agenda that is very big agenda today, right? And he got complaints from the public. He investigated himself. He called the officers in, and he told the police commissioner, "I expect X to be done." Corruption was not as big a deal to him. It was the cutting-edge issue for the reform movement. He actually got elected more on the question of police violence. Anyway, they decide that they're going to consolidate the vice enforcement in a unit that's generally called the strong arm squad. And he and his commissioner pick this Lieutenant Charles Becker to head it. And they were as violent and aggressive as their name kind of indicates. And they're shaking up a lot of neighborhoods, getting a lot of people angry. It's the old outside task force approach. I have one little thing in the paper where the Brooklyn Eagle and local police officers on the beat are very critical of them for coming in and invading the local black community and arresting all the people they knew to be, the respectable people in a sweep. They're also, pretty violent. But they also handled vice and vice enforcement. And what that worked out to do was that it just centralized the shakedown system. And Becker turned out to be totally crooked. He was very, highly respected cop. And then there was a gambler who just decided he was tired of being shaken down by Becker, and he went to the DA, Charles Whitman, who became governor later, Manhattan DA. And literally 6 hours before he's supposed to go and meet with Whitman and spill the whole story, he gets murdered in Times Square. And that sets off this giant scandal. It's an important part of the story just because it affects everything that happens in the police department. But also I included it because it was a former Italian squad detective who the commissioner had, demoted, lowered his pay by 40% and sent him out into the sticks on patrol, who they called back in to work the case. And he made a key arrest. There were 4 gunmen, and he made the first of the arrests of the gunmen.
That was a really striking theme for me, and this isn't to diminish the role of police brutality today, but the sort of commonplace of not just shakedowns, but also beatdowns. I mean, another part of the book with different characters. You talk about just the third degree and the sort of relish with which the officers will take in suspects or even people who they just want to have the actual people they want to target, scare them into, thinking of it, that they'll be tortured next, right? If they hear the screams. I mean, just incredible practices. So talk a little bit about that. And was it how bad was it then? It sounds pretty bad.
The Italian squad, I would say, had a reputation for being pretty rough, but it's a little hard to tell because the newspapers seemed to enjoy it if they were beating up Italians. There was a grand jury report at the presentment at the time, urging that the police, use more violence on people in bad neighborhoods.
Incredible.
There was. It's pretty clear to me that there was a wanton use of nightsticks, and that's why Mayor Gaynor could run on this issue. This was not just confined to even a minority group. I think that there was a citywide identification with this issue that Mayor Gaynor raised in 1910. With the Italian squad, I think they were often in a position where they knew who committed a crime, but could not prove it unless there was a confession. And it's no excuse, but I think their violence was pretty targeted. It does seem to be pretty routine in arrests. Where you read that they ran after a guy that caught him and they beat him with their butts of their pistols, or you see that a lot, and it's all in there. The most horrendous scene comes kind of late in the Italian squad's existence when a very famous detective, nationally famous detective, Michael Fiaschetti, headed the squad, and it was a kidnapping case. Little boy, 5 years old. They arrested the people who showed up to, get the money and all that. Probably a mistake. They maybe should have waited and followed those people because they didn't know where the boy was being kept. So they thought they could get it out of them, and they did just about everything that could be done to somebody, and they didn't get it out of them. Fiaschetti writes a memoir later on when he's in private life, and says and talks about how when he found out that this little boy had been murdered, he comes back to the jail and beats the heck out of these people. So that's picked up in a national report on police violence. It's kind of the first national commission on law enforcement in 1930, called the Wickersham Commission. And so he kind of becomes famous even to this day as one of the examples of police violence. So it's definitely a part of the story. Although I think that Fiaschetti was probably pretty good at persuading people to talk. He was a very good detective. But on this occasion, they just were beating them for hours and hours and couldn't get anything out of them. There was a police reporter who later wrote in a book who said he'd never seen people beaten so badly. And he was a very long-time police reporter. So it is a part of the story, and it was an issue then too. It's not just like, oh, everybody does this. There were politicians who were making an issue of it at that time, including a mayor.
Yeah. And I think another political aspect that comes through in your telling, I mean, there were both kind of targeted crimes, such as the kidnapping of this boy that the kidnappers thought was rich, but his family wasn't. But also, these shootings of bystanders are sort of another kind of galvanizing event. And there is this kind of theme also of just like random gun violence and also bombings and just sort of, a lot of, I think people may be familiar with the anarchist bombings and sort of how that kind of came on the landscape later, or the mad bomber later on. But these bombings were part of extortion efforts and other kind of targeted mob-related attacks that had collateral damage and put all kinds of people at risk.
Yeah, there was this thing called the so-called Black Hand. Never a big organization. That was always a false portrayal that everybody believed because they read it. It was just isolated groups of thugs who adopted this scary label of a black hand on their extortion letters. But there were a lot of bombings. Bombs would be set in tenements at night, some very dangerous stuff. And so really the bomb squad sort of evolved out of the Italian squad because detectives like Correa were really handling a lot of bombings. A little bit later in the teens, you start getting, serious concerns about anarchist bombings also. And at that point, really the bomb squad became a separate entity and focused. Really, the bomb squad was really like a radical squad. There were all kinds of civil liberties issues attached to their methods also.
Yeah, and there was one bombing attempt that was unsuccessful, which yet another thing I learned about for the first time from your book, which is St. Patrick's Cathedral was also a target, and this was a case that really brought up all kinds of questions about entrapment, and there was you had an undercover agent who's working within this group of Italian anarchists. So there's a connection at that time. Some very thorny issues that played out there.
This is around 1915, and it's a period in which the Italian squad supposedly was folded in with the bomb squad, but really there were just about no Italian-speaking officers on it. So there were a number of anarchist attacks on churches in that period, and so the head of the squad, concerned about this, starts looking for an Italian-speaking officer and takes this young fellow right out of training, Amedeo Polignani. And they send him in, by himself again. And they seem to be making all the exact mistakes they did with Petrosino, to the point where after this whole thing is disclosed, Petrosino's widow, Adelina Petrosino, gives an interview to the papers saying, how could they be doing this? You've made a target of this poor young fellow, and his, pictures in the newspapers with his wife and everything. Fortunately, nothing happened to Amedeo Polignani, but the way the investigation was handled, he went a long way towards inducing these two kind of hangers-on to the anarchist gang to do the bombing. And they were caught before a bomb was actually exploded. But entrapment law, which was really almost non-existent at the time, has always it's not an easy defense to prove. So would they have done it without him helping to pay for the materials and a place to, build the bomb and all that? I don't know. So the anarchists had some grounds to be angry, but they were convicted. The jury was persuaded that, they were in it. There was no question, but, Anyway, it's one of those murky things, and it is kind of reminiscent of a lot of cases that have been made post 9/11, where say the FBI will have an informant who talks to somebody, and there's always the question of, is this informant making this happen, or would it have happened without him?
Yeah, it's just another example of what we were talking about before, of these methods that I think now we'd look back and think, no, but like, no way, but we're commonplace then. So last question for you, Paul. I just wanted to know, were there any kind of records or questions or pieces of the history that you really chased after, really hoped to get, but you really, the documentation just wasn't there, or where, just some aspect eluded you, but you really had questions you wanted to answer?
You always want to know more, nothing's jumping to mind right away, but there were a lot of things that were useful in piecing things together, but I didn't see personnel files. Part of the problem is that before 1915, I think the police department just kind of lost all their records. I'm not the first to find that out. But there were some good tools like the City Record. The City Record. I know
the City Record.
The fine print newspaper with all the boring stuff. Well, back in those days, they used to put every police personnel move in there. So stuff like that was very valuable in piecing together what happened. But, I always want to get more into their personal lives. And, there's just only so much documentation for that. I was lucky to have a diary for Anthony Vacris for a period of a few months, but stuff like that really gives you the flavor. So there's not much of that around. Maybe it's out there somewhere, but I didn't find that.
Okay, well, Paul Moses, thank you so much for joining us. Moses is the author of The Italian Squad, The True Story of the Immigrant Cops Who Fought the Rise of the Mafia. Thank you so much for joining FAQ NYC.
It's a pleasure, Alyssa. Thank you.
FAQ.
This has been FAQ NYC. We're part of The City, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom dedicated to hard-hitting reporting that serves the people of New York. Our work is freely available to everyone at thecity.nyc and is supported by listeners and readers like you. Go to thecity.nyc/give if you'd like to pitch in. We are an affiliate of NYU's McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research and a proud member of the Brick House Cooperative of Independent Journalists, Critics, and Artists. Find it all at popula.com. I'm your host, Alyssa Katz, executive editor of The City. Harry Siegel is our executive producer, and Adam Camara is our engineer. A special thank you to our guest, Paul Moses, and thank you, listener, for joining us and making it this far. Be kind, be cool, and we'll be back soon with more.